They smiled and cheered when I walked down the aisle in my grandmother's vintage lace dress. They threw rose petals when Marcus and I exchanged vows under the cherry blossom arch at Moonridge Gardens. They raised their champagne flutes when the photographer captured our first kiss as husband and wife. But they went dead silent when my sister Vivian leaned over to my father during the reception and whispered just loud enough for the head table to hear, "Go take her ring, Dad. She doesn't deserve it." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Isabella Chen-Rodriguez. I'm 28 years old. I'm a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Riverside Valley, and I just married the love of my life in what should have been the happiest day of my existence. Instead, it became the day I discovered that my own family had been planning to steal my inheritance right there in front of 150 wedding guests. The ring they wanted? It wasn't just any ring. It was my great-grandmother Elena's sapphire and diamond engagement ring from 1923, a family heirloom worth approximately $45,000 that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. My grandmother, Rosa, had given it to me on her deathbed 3 years ago with explicit instructions: "This goes to Isabella when she finds true love. She'll know what real commitment means." But here's what I didn't know until that moment at my own wedding reception: my family had never intended for me to keep it. For months leading up to the wedding, there had been strange comments. My Aunt Carmen asking if I was sure about Marcus because marriage is such a big commitment for someone so young. My cousin Diego suggesting that maybe I should wait a few more years before taking such a permanent step. My mother, Patricia, wondering out loud if I really understood what the ring represented for our family legacy. I thought they were just being protective. You know, typical family concerns about marriage, about making sure I was ready, about wanting what's best for me. I brushed off the questions, laughed at their worries, assured them that Marcus and I had been together for 4 years, that we'd talked through everything, that we were absolutely certain about our future together. What I didn't realize was that every question was actually reconnaissance. Every doubt they expressed was them testing the waters, seeing if they could plant enough uncertainty in my mind to make me postpone the wedding. Because postponing the wedding meant postponing the moment when that ring would officially symbolize my new life as a married woman. The truth is, my family had already decided among themselves that the ring should go to Vivian instead. Why? Because Vivian, at 26, had been dating the same guy, Trevor, for 6 months and was more mature about relationships. Because she was the one who really appreciated family history and would honor the tradition properly. Because, and this is the part that stings the most, they believed that my choice to marry Marcus, who isn't Latino, meant I was abandoning my heritage and therefore didn't deserve to carry on a family tradition. They never said this to my face, of course. Instead, they spent months dropping hints that maybe I was rushing things with Marcus. Maybe I should think more carefully about such a big decision. Maybe the ring was too valuable for someone my age to be responsible for. Maybe it would be safer if it stayed with Mom for a few more years until I was more settled. But I was settled. I had a steady job I loved, a man who supported my dreams, and a clear vision for my future. The problem wasn't that I wasn't ready for marriage. The problem was that I was marrying someone they didn't think fit their image of who I should be with. Marcus is a 3rd-generation Irish-American software engineer who grew up in the suburbs of Willowbrook Heights. He's kind, stable, ambitious, and he loves me completely, including my culture, my language, my family traditions, and yes, even the complicated dynamics that come with all of it. He learned Spanish to talk to my grandmother before she passed. He helped me cook traditional dishes for family gatherings. He was the one who suggested we have both a Catholic ceremony and a mariachi band at the reception. But none of that mattered to my family. What mattered was that his last name was O'Sullivan, not something that ended in EZ or A. What mattered was that our future children would have lighter skin and might not speak Spanish as their first language. What mattered was that I was choosing love over the cultural expectations they built up around who I should marry. So when Vivian whispered those words to my father, "Go take her ring, Dad. She doesn't deserve it," she wasn't talking about worthiness in general. She was talking about worthiness according to their specific, narrow definition of what it meant to honor our family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And my father? He actually started to stand up. At my wedding reception. In front of all our guests. He began to rise from his chair with this look of grim determination, like he was about to march over to me and demand that I hand over my great-grandmother's ring right there on the dance floor. That's when I realized this wasn't a spontaneous moment of family drama. This was a coordinated plan. They had discussed this. They had agreed on this. They had decided that my wedding day was going to be the day they took back what they believed I'd forfeited by choosing my own path. The ring on my finger suddenly felt heavier. Not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a choice between honoring my family's expectations or honoring my own heart. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, I realized I was about to find out exactly who was really on my side. I'm Isabella Chen-Rodriguez, and before I tell you what happened next at that reception, you need to understand who I am and how I got to that moment of having to choose between my family's approval and my own happiness. I'm 28 years old, and I've been a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Riverside Valley for the past 5 years. It's not just a job for me. It's a calling that chose me when I was 16 and volunteering at the hospital where my younger brother Miguel was getting treatment for leukemia. I watched nurses like Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Kim turn the scariest moments of our family's life into manageable pieces, and I knew I wanted to be that person for other families facing the unthinkable. The work isn't easy. 12-hour shifts, life or death decisions, holding the hands of parents who are watching their children fight battles no child should have to face. But it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Last month, I helped a 7-year-old named Emma celebrate being cancer-free after 18 months of treatment. The month before that, I was part of the team that saved a newborn who came in with a heart defect. These aren't just cases to me, they're reasons I get up every morning. But here's what made my relationship with my family complicated. Nursing wasn't their dream for me. They wanted me to be a lawyer like my cousin Sophia, or a business owner like my uncle Ramon, or at least marry someone who could elevate the family status, in our tight-knit community of Esperanza Heights. My parents, Patricia and Eduardo, immigrated from Guadalajara when I was 2 years old. They worked multiple jobs, dad as a landscaper and weekend construction worker, mom cleaning office buildings at night and watching neighborhood kids during the day, so that my brother Miguel and I could have opportunities they never had. Every sacrifice they made came with an unspoken expectation. We would honor their struggles by achieving something impressive that they could be proud of in front of their friends at church, at family gatherings, in the close-knit community where everyone knows everyone's business. Nursing, to them, was just taking care of sick people. Not prestigious enough. Not lucrative enough. Not the kind of career that would make other families look up to ours with respect and maybe a little envy. And Marcus? Marcus represented everything they were afraid I was choosing instead of honoring their vision for my life. I met Marcus O'Sullivan 3.5 years ago at a coffee shop near the hospital. I was coming off a particularly brutal shift. We'd lost a patient, a 6-year-old named David, and I was sitting alone at a corner table trying not to cry into my latte. Marcus was at the next table working on his laptop, and when he noticed I was struggling, he quietly slid a packet of tissues across to my table without saying a word or making me feel awkward about it. That simple act of kindness, that intuitive understanding of what I needed in that moment, told me everything about who he was as a person. Marcus is a software engineer who designs educational apps for children with learning disabilities. He's quiet where my family is loud, methodical where we're spontaneous, and he approaches problems by researching solutions rather than talking through emotions with 12 different relatives until someone offers an opinion that sticks. To my family, this made him seem cold, disconnected, not one of us. They didn't understand that his way of showing love was learning Spanish so he could talk to my grandmother Rosa in her own language during her final months. They didn't appreciate that he spent his weekends volunteering at the literacy center in our neighborhood, teaching computer skills to recent immigrants. They couldn't see that he supported my career completely, picking up dinner on my late shifts, listening to me decompress after difficult days, celebrating every small victory with patience as if they were his own family. What they saw was a white guy from the suburbs who didn't dance at parties, who asked questions instead of just accepting family traditions, and who would never understand what it means to be Mexican American in this country. The ring, my great-grandmother Elena's sapphire and diamond engagement ring from 1923, had become the symbol of everything they feared I was walking away from. Elena had received it from her husband Antonio when they married in a small church in Guadalajara. She wore it through raising 6 children during the Depression, through Antonio's death when she was only 52, through immigrating to California in 1965 to be near her daughter Rosa, my grandmother. Rosa had worn it for 43 years of marriage to my grandfather Manuel. She'd polished it carefully every Sunday after church, told me stories about Elena's strength and resilience, and promised that someday it would be mine when I was ready to understand what commitment really meant. When Rosa died 3 years ago, she left specific instructions in her will. The ring goes to Isabella when she marries for love, not convenience or family expectations, but real, deep, lasting love. My family had apparently decided that marrying Marcus didn't qualify. For the past 8 months, as Marcus and I planned our wedding, I'd been navigating increasingly uncomfortable conversations about whether I was really ready for marriage, whether the ring was too valuable for someone my age, whether I understood the responsibility that came with carrying on family traditions. I thought they were just being protective grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles who wanted to make sure I wasn't making a mistake. I had no idea they were building a case for why I should be stripped of my inheritance on my own wedding day. But I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go. The questioning started subtly about 8 months before the wedding, right after Marcus and I announced our engagement at my cousin Elena's quinceañera. We were sitting at the family table, still glowing from sharing our news, when my Aunt Carmen leaned over with what seemed like innocent curiosity. "So Isabella, how long have you two been together again?" she asked, even though she'd met Marcus multiple times over the past 3 years. When I reminded her it had been 3.5 years, she nodded slowly, that particular nod that Mexican aunties perfect, the one that says they're processing information they don't quite approve of. "And you're sure you're ready? Marriage is such a big step, Mija. Especially when you're still so young and focused on your career." At the time, I laughed it off. "Tia, I'm 28, not 18. And Marcus and I have talked about everything, finances, kids, where we want to live, how to balance work and family. We're ready." But Carmen's expression didn't change. "It's just that nurses work such long hours. And with his job requiring so much computer time, when will you actually see each other? Marriage needs attention, Isabella. Constant attention." That was the first seed. Not planted maliciously, at least not obviously, but planted nonetheless. Over the next few weeks, similar conversations began sprouting up at family gatherings, Sunday dinners, even random phone calls. My cousin Sophia, the successful immigration lawyer, started asking pointed questions about Marcus's cultural understanding. Had he ever dated a Latina before? Did he really understand what it meant to be part of a Mexican-American family? Would he expect me to abandon traditions that didn't make sense to him? "I'm just thinking about your future children, Prima," Sophia would say, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "They'll be half Irish. Will they even speak Spanish? Will they understand where they come from?" My uncle Ramon, who owned 3 successful restaurants in downtown Riverside Valley, took a different approach. He'd corner Marcus at family events and pepper him with questions that felt more like job interviews than casual conversation. "So, software engineering," Ramon would begin, nodding like he was impressed. "That's good money, right? Stable?" Because Isabella's used to being independent, but when kids come along, someone needs to provide security. These weren't random concerns from well-meaning relatives. Looking back now, I can see the coordination, the way they were each testing different angles, probing for weaknesses in our relationship that they could amplify later. My mother Patricia was the most strategic of all. She never directly questioned my choice to marry Marcus. Instead, she'd make observations that lodged themselves in my brain like splinters. "You know, Mija, I ran into Mrs. Hernandez at the grocery store yesterday. Her daughter Carmen just got engaged to that nice boy from church. You remember Diego Morales? His family owns the construction company. Mrs. Hernandez was just glowing, talking about how perfect they are together, how Diego already feels like part of their family, how their grandchildren will grow up understanding both sides of their heritage. Then she'd pause, letting the implication hang in the air before adding, "It's so nice when families blend naturally, don't you think?" The comments about the ring started around month 5 of wedding planning. I was at my parents' house helping Mom organize old family photos when she pulled out a small velvet box from her jewelry drawer. "I've been thinking about Abuela Rosa's ring," she said, opening the box to reveal the sapphire and diamond engagement ring that had been promised to me. "It's such a valuable piece. So much history. I worry about it getting lost or damaged in all the wedding chaos." I reached for the box, but she closed it gently. "Maybe it would be safer if it stayed here until after the honeymoon? Until you and Marcus are more settled?" "Mom, the ring is supposed to be my engagement ring. That was Abuela's wish." I know, she said quickly. "But think about it, Isabella. This ring represents 4 generations of strong Mexican women who understood what family means. Abuela Elena wore it while raising 6 children during impossible times. Abuela Rosa wore it through 43 years of marriage to a man who never forgot where he came from." She opened the box again, letting the sapphire catch the afternoon light streaming through her kitchen window. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" The doubt crept in slowly, the way cold seeps through a poorly sealed window. Not doubt about Marcus, I knew he was the right person for me with absolute certainty. But doubt about whether I was somehow betraying my heritage by choosing him. Doubt about whether my future children would feel connected to their Mexican roots. Doubt about whether I was being selfish by prioritizing my own happiness over my family's expectations. I started having conversations with Marcus that I'd never thought I'd need to have. Did he really understand what it meant to marry into a Mexican family? Was he prepared for the chaos of our celebrations, the way everyone talks at once, the expectation that he'd learn not just our traditions but our complicated family politics? Marcus, bless him, thought these were normal pre-wedding nerves amplified by normal family dynamics. He reassured me that he loved my culture, that he was excited to be part of it, that our children would grow up bilingual and bicultural. But my family's campaign was working. By month 6, I found myself second-guessing decisions we'd already made. Should we have the ceremony entirely in Spanish? Should we serve only traditional Mexican food at the reception? Should we postpone the wedding until Marcus had more time to really understand what he was marrying into? Each question felt reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of erosion, wearing away at my confidence like water carving canyons through solid rock. The worst part was that I couldn't tell if their concerns were legitimate or manipulative. These were people who loved me, who had supported me through nursing school, who had celebrated my successes and comforted me through failures. Was it possible they could see something I was missing? That doubt, that tiny, persistent voice asking, "What if they're right?" was exactly what they were counting on. The erosion of who I was happened so gradually that I didn't notice it until I was already drowning. It wasn't just the questioning about Marcus or the wedding, it was the systematic way my family had been editing me out of my own narrative for years, reducing me to nothing more than the decisions they disagreed with. When I graduated from nursing school 5 years ago, summa cum laude with a specialty certification in pediatric oncology, my family threw a small party at my parents' house. It was nice, don't get me wrong. Mom made my favorite pozole, Dad grilled carne asada, and about 30 relatives showed up with congratulations and hugs. But the conversations that night weren't really about my achievement. "She's so smart," my Aunt Lucia said to my mother, as if I wasn't standing right there. "Such a shame she didn't go to law school like Sophia. She could have been making real money by now." "Isabella always was too soft-hearted," my Uncle Ramon added, balancing a plate of food while pontificating about my life choices. "Nursing is fine, but it's not a career that builds wealth. She'll struggle to buy a house, support a family properly." My cousin Diego nodded sagely, despite being 24 and still living in his parents' converted garage. "She should have studied business. Healthcare is a dead end unless you become a doctor." I stood there in my own graduation party, listening to my family discuss my limitations while wearing my cap and gown, and I realized they weren't celebrating what I'd accomplished. They were mourning what I hadn't become. This pattern repeated itself over and over. When I got my first promotion at Children's Hospital, becoming the youngest charge nurse in the pediatric ICU, the family dinner conversation focused on how stressful my job was and whether I was burning myself out, instead of how proud they were. When I received the Excellence in Patient Care Award from the hospital board, my mother's first comment was, "That's nice, Mija, but awards don't pay the bills." They never asked about the 12-year-old patient who credited me with helping her feel brave during chemotherapy. They never wanted to hear about the parents who wrote letters thanking me for guiding them through the worst nights of their lives. They never celebrated the fact that I'd found work that felt like purpose, not just a paycheck. Instead, they treated my career like a phase I'd eventually outgrow once I matured and realized what really mattered, which, according to them, was finding a husband who could provide the kind of lifestyle they believed I deserved. The invisibility extended beyond my professional life. When I bought my first car with my own money, a reliable Honda Civic that would get me safely to and from night shifts, my father spent the entire family dinner explaining what I should have purchased instead. "She could have gotten something with more style," he told Marcus during one of our early visits together. "Something that shows she has good taste, that she understands quality. But she's always been too practical for her own good." I was sitting at the same table, but the conversation about my decision-making happened around me, not with me. When I decided to rent a small apartment near the hospital instead of staying at home until marriage, my family treated it like a rebellion rather than a normal adult milestone. My mother would call every few days, not to ask how I was doing, but to inform me about problems with my decision to live alone. "Mrs. Flores asked about you at church," she'd say. "She was surprised to hear you moved out. She said most good daughters stay home until they're married, save money, help their families." I didn't know what to tell her. These weren't direct criticisms, but they carried the weight of judgment. Every choice I made that prioritized my independence was reframed as evidence that I was drifting away from family values, becoming too American, losing sight of what really mattered. The most painful part was how they talked about my relationship with Marcus before our engagement. For 3 years, I brought him to family gatherings, holiday celebrations, Sunday dinners. He learned Spanish phrases to talk with my grandmother. He brought thoughtful gifts for birthdays and Christmas. He helped my uncle Ramon move furniture when his restaurant expanded. He was respectful, kind, and genuinely interested in being part of our family. But instead of acknowledging his efforts, my family found fault with every gesture. When he brought flowers for my mother, she commented later that they were too formal, he was trying too hard. When he asked questions about our traditions, they said he was too analytical, couldn't he just accept things naturally? When he offered to help with cooking during celebrations, they said he was interfering, didn't he understand that the kitchen was women's space during family events? They never once asked me how Marcus made me feel. They never inquired about whether he supported my goals, whether he made me laugh, whether I felt loved and valued in his presence. Those questions, the ones that actually mattered for my happiness, were apparently irrelevant compared to whether he fit their predetermined image of who I should marry. Even my close relationship with my grandmother Rosa became ammunition against me. Rosa and I had spent countless hours together during her final year, and I was the one who stayed with her during her last weeks, holding her hand through her final nights. She'd given me the ring because we'd talked extensively about love, commitment, and what it meant to honor family while still following your own heart. But after Rosa's death, my family began rewriting those conversations. Suddenly, they remembered Rosa expressing concerns about my independence. They recalled her wondering if I was too focused on my career to be a good wife. They knew she would have wanted the ring to go to someone who understood traditional family values. These revised memories were presented as fact, as evidence that even Rosa, the person who knew me best, who had explicitly chosen to give me the ring, had really wanted something different for me. By the time Marcus and I got engaged, I had been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt my own judgment that their escalating concerns felt legitimate. When they questioned whether I was ready for marriage, I wondered if they could see immaturity I was blind to. When they suggested postponing the wedding, I asked myself if I was rushing into something I hadn't fully considered. I started second-guessing instincts that had never failed me before, questioning decisions that felt absolutely right in my heart but apparently looked wrong to everyone who claimed to love me most. The cruelest part was that I couldn't tell the difference between genuine concern and calculated manipulation, because I'd never imagined that my own family would orchestrate my self-doubt for their own agenda. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in February, exactly 6 months before our planned August wedding. I was just getting home from a particularly long shift. We'd had 3 emergency admissions in pediatric ICU, and I was emotionally drained but still running on adrenaline. Marcus was working late on a project deadline, so I was looking forward to a quiet evening with leftovers and a mindless Netflix show. My phone rang as I was kicking off my shoes. Mom's name flashed on the screen, which wasn't unusual. She called most evenings around this time to check in, share neighborhood gossip, or ask about wedding planning progress. Hija, she began, but her voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard in months. I have the most wonderful news. You remember my friend Esperanza from church? Her daughter works at that beautiful venue in the mountains, Casa de las Rosas. Well, there's been a cancellation for your exact wedding date. I paused, one shoe halfway off my foot. Mom, we already have a venue. Moonridge Gardens. We've put down deposits, we've done the tasting, we've sent save the dates with the address. I know, she said quickly, but Isabella, you haven't seen this place. It's absolutely magical. Built in 1890, surrounded by rose gardens that bloom in every color you can imagine. And the chapel, oh, Mija, it's like something from a fairy tale. Stone walls, stained glass windows, wooden pews that have hosted hundreds of Mexican families for generations. She paused for breath, then continued with building enthusiasm. The best part is the history. This venue has been hosting traditional Mexican weddings for over a century. The families who get married there, they understand what it means to honor their heritage. They have mariachi musicians on staff, authentic cuisine, everything arranged to celebrate our culture properly. I sat down heavily on my couch, already sensing where this conversation was heading. Mom, Moonridge Gardens is beautiful too. We chose it together, Marcus and I. It represents us. But does it represent your family? She asked, her voice shifting to that particular tone that always made me feel like I was failing some test I didn't know I was taking. Does it honor your grandmother Rosa's memory? Does it show respect for the generations of women who came before you? I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling onto my shoulders. The venue doesn't determine how much I respect Abuela Rosa. The love Marcus and I share, the commitment we're making, that's what honors her memory. Oh, Mija, my mother sighed, and I could picture her shaking her head in that disappointed way that always made me feel 10 years old. I just worry that you're so focused on what you and Marcus want that you're forgetting about everyone else who loves you. Everyone else? Your family, Isabella. The people who raised you, who sacrificed for you, who will be celebrating this day with you. Don't you think we deserve to feel comfortable in the place where our daughter gets married? That word, deserve, hit me like a physical blow. My family deserved to feel comfortable at my wedding, but somehow my own comfort in the venue I'd chosen with my fiancé was selfish. Mom, you said you liked Moonridge Gardens when we visited together. You said it was elegant and romantic. I was being polite, Mija. I didn't want to hurt your feelings when you seemed so excited about it. But if I'm being honest, it felt cold. Impersonal. Like a place where business deals get made, not where families come together to celebrate love. This was news to me. 3 months earlier, my mother had toured Moonridge Gardens with Marcus and me, asked detailed questions about catering options, complimented the garden spaces where we planned to take photos, and even suggested specific spots where she thought the mariachi band could set up during cocktail hour. But you helped us plan the layout, I said, confusion creeping into my voice. You said the outdoor ceremony space was perfect for our vision. I was trying to be supportive, she replied, her voice taking on a martyred quality that I was beginning to recognize as manipulation, though I couldn't bring myself to call it that yet. But Isabella, this is your one wedding day. Don't you want it to be perfect? Don't you want to look back in 20 years and feel proud of how you honored your heritage? She let that question hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. Besides, Casa de los Roses costs exactly the same as your current venue. Esperanza already checked. We could transfer everything, the deposits, the catering contract, even the flowers. The only thing that would change is that your wedding would actually feel like a celebration of who you really are. Who I really was. According to my mother, who I really was couldn't be celebrated at the venue Marcus and I had carefully chosen together. Who I really was required a location that prioritized my family's comfort over my own vision for my wedding day. I need to talk to Marcus about this, I said finally. Of course, Mom agreed quickly. But Isabella, don't wait too long. This cancellation won't stay available forever. These kinds of opportunities, they're gifts from God. Signs that you're making the right choices. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. 6 months of planning, 6 months of excitement about walking down the aisle at Moonridge Gardens, 6 months of imagining our first dance under the string lights we'd specifically chosen for that space, all of it suddenly felt wrong, selfish, inconsiderate. When Marcus came home an hour later, I was still sitting in the same spot, staring at my phone. "Hey," he said, dropping his laptop bag and immediately noticing my expression. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I told him about the phone call, about Casa de los Roses, about my mother's concerns that our current venue didn't properly represent my heritage. As I spoke, I watched his face carefully, looking for signs that maybe he'd been having similar doubts, that maybe he also thought we should reconsider. Instead, Marcus sat down next to me and took my hands. "Isabella," he said gently, "do you want to change venues?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I love Moonridge Gardens. I love what we've planned there. But what if my mom is right? What if I'm being selfish?" "You're not being selfish for wanting your wedding to reflect your relationship," he said firmly. "But if you truly want to look at other options, I'm open to it. This is your day too." The problem was that I couldn't tell anymore what I truly wanted versus what I thought I should want. My family's voices had become so loud in my head that my own preferences were getting drowned out. That night, I called Moonridge Gardens and asked about their cancellation policy, just to see what our options were. The coordinator was surprised but professional, explaining that we'd lose our deposits if we canceled less than 6 months out. Somehow, that financial penalty felt like a sign that I was even considering abandoning the plans Marcus and I had made together. But the seed had been planted, and like all the other doubts my family had carefully cultivated, it was already beginning to grow. After the venue conversation, the wedding planning transformed from something joyful Marcus and I did together into something that felt like a negotiation between competing interests. Every decision became a minefield of family opinions, cultural expectations, and my increasingly fragmented sense of what I actually wanted. The dress shopping expedition perfectly encapsulated how thoroughly my agency had been eroded. Originally, I'd planned to go with just my maid of honor, my college friend Jennifer, and maybe my mother. Simple, low pressure, focused on finding something that made me feel beautiful and confident. But when I mentioned this plan at Sunday dinner, suddenly everyone had opinions about who should be included. "You have to take your sister Vivian," my Aunt Carmen declared as if it were obvious. "She has such good taste, and she understands what looks elegant on our family." "And your cousin Sophia," my mother added. "She knows about quality. She won't let you choose something you'll regret later." "I should come too," chimed in my other aunt, Lucia. "I helped choose your cousin Maria's dress last year, and everyone said it was perfect for her body type." Before I knew it, what should have been an intimate experience with my closest friend had mushroomed into a group outing with 7 women, each with strong opinions about what a proper Mexican bride should wear. The appointment at Estrella Bridal Boutique in downtown Riverside Valley became a performance where I was somehow both the star and the least important voice in the room. I tried on dress after dress while my female relatives debated the merits of each option as if I were a mannequin incapable of forming my own preferences. The dress I fell in love with was simple but stunning, a sleek A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and a chapel train that made me feel like a graceful, confident version of myself. When I stepped out of the fitting room wearing it, Jennifer gasped and said, "Isabella, that's the one. You look absolutely radiant." But my family had different ideas. It's too plain, Vivian said immediately, circling me like a fashion critic. Where's the drama? Where's the presence? A bride should make a statement. The neckline is too high, Sophia added, adjusting her designer glasses as she examined me from multiple angles. It's not flattering. It makes you look conservative. Older. And the lace, Lucia shook her head disapprovingly. It's too modern. It doesn't have the traditional feel that would honor your grandmother's memory. My mother, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. It's beautiful, Mija, but, are you sure it's special enough? This is your one wedding day. Shouldn't you choose something that feels more significant? I stared at myself in the three-way mirror, watching my reflection fracture into different angles while their criticisms echoed around me. In that dress, I had felt beautiful, confident, like the best version of myself. But their words were systematically dismantling that feeling, replacing it with doubt and inadequacy. What kind of dress do you think I should wear? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. That question unleashed an avalanche of opinions. Vivian pulled out her phone to show me pictures of elaborate ball gowns with layers of tulle and crystal beading. Sophia advocated for something more sophisticated, with dramatic off-the-shoulder sleeves and a mermaid silhouette. Lucia insisted I needed something with traditional elements, perhaps embroidered details that referenced Mexican textile patterns. For the next 2 hours, I tried on dress after dress that reflected their vision rather than mine. Each gown was beautiful in its own way, but none of them felt like me. I felt like I was playing dress-up for someone else's wedding while my own preferences became increasingly irrelevant. The dress they finally convinced me to choose was an elaborate ball gown with a sweetheart neckline, layers of tulle, and intricate beadwork that caught the light beautifully. It was objectively stunning, the kind of dress that would photograph well and impress guests. But when I looked at myself wearing it, I saw a costume rather than a wedding dress. Now that's a dress worthy of our family, Vivian declared with satisfaction, and everyone nodded in agreement. I put down a deposit, scheduled fittings, and walked out of the boutique feeling like I had just purchased someone else's dream while abandoning my own. The same pattern repeated with every subsequent decision. The flowers I originally wanted, simple white roses and eucalyptus, elegant and understated, were deemed too boring and replaced with elaborate arrangements featuring bright pink peonies, orange marigolds, and purple orchids that would photograph better and show more personality. The menu Marcus and I had carefully chosen, a blend of Mexican and Irish dishes that represented both our heritages, was criticized as confused and trying too hard to please everyone. My family pushed for a completely traditional Mexican spread, while Marcus's parents quietly suggested that perhaps some of their guests might prefer more familiar options. The music became another battlefield. Marcus and I had planned to have a mariachi band for the ceremony and cocktail hour, then transition to a DJ who could play a mix of genres for dancing. But my uncle Ramon insisted that a proper Mexican wedding required live music all night, while Marcus's family wondered if we could include some Irish traditional music to honor his heritage. Every compromise felt like a small betrayal of either my family's expectations or my own vision. I found myself constantly apologizing to someone, to Marcus for caving to my family's pressure, to my family for including elements they didn't appreciate, to his family for not being more accommodating to their preferences. The worst part was how I had become a stranger to myself in the planning process. I would catch myself in conversations agreeing to things I didn't actually want, defending choices I hadn't actually made, and apologizing for preferences I did actually have. Jennifer, my maid of honor, finally confronted me about it 3 weeks before the wedding when I called her in tears after yet another family suggestion session. Isabella, she said firmly after I'd finished explaining the latest round of changes to our reception timeline, whose wedding is this? Mine, I said automatically. Are you sure? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're planning your family's ideal wedding while completely ignoring what you and Marcus actually want. She was right, but admitting it felt like admitting that I was weak, ungrateful, or selfish, all the things my family's subtle messaging had conditioned me to fear being. They just want what's best for me, I said weakly. Do they? Jennifer asked. Or do they want what makes them most comfortable, regardless of what makes you happy? That question haunted me for days, but I was too deep into the planning process to imagine changing course. The wedding was 3 weeks away. Invitations had been sent. Vendors were booked. Family members had made travel arrangements. I told myself that once the wedding day arrived, once Marcus and I were actually married, none of these planning details would matter. What mattered was our commitment to each other, not whether my dress reflected my personal style or whether the flowers matched my original vision. I had no idea that the real test of that commitment was still to come. The erasure of my presence from my own wedding happened so systematically that I didn't fully recognize it until I was holding the final programs in my hands 3 days before the ceremony. I had been so focused on managing everyone else's expectations and keeping peace between competing visions that I hadn't noticed how thoroughly I had disappeared from the narrative of my own celebration. It started with the wedding website Marcus and I had created together. We'd spent hours crafting our love story, choosing photos that captured our relationship's journey, and writing descriptions of our wedding party that reflected how much each person meant to us. But when my cousin Sophia offered to help polish the language, because she was better with words, as a lawyer, I gratefully handed over the editing responsibilities. The website that went live was beautiful and professional, but it read like it was about strangers. Our love story had been rewritten to emphasize how Marcus had adapted to Mexican culture, rather than how we had built a relationship that honored both our backgrounds. The descriptions of our wedding party focused on their relationships to my family rather than their relationships to me personally. Most tellingly, the "About the Bride" section had been transformed from my voice into a third-person description that sounded like a resume designed to impress potential in-laws. Instead of mentioning my passion for pediatric nursing, my love of hiking with Marcus, or my dream of traveling to Ireland to meet his grandmother, it focused on my degree, my successful career, and my commitment to family values. I had become a character in someone else's story about what a Mexican-American bride should be, rather than a real person celebrating her actual life and choices. The wedding invitations told the same story. My mother had insisted on overseeing the design process because she understood the importance of making a good impression. The final product was undeniably elegant, thick cardstock with embossed gold lettering and traditional Catholic imagery that my grandmother would have loved. But when I read the wording, my heart sank. Instead of "Isabella Chen-Rodriguez and Marcus O'Sullivan request the pleasure of your company," the invitations read, "Eduardo and Patricia Chen-Rodriguez cordially invite you to the wedding celebration of their daughter Isabella to Marcus Patrick O'Sullivan." The phrasing made me sound like property being transferred from one family to another rather than an independent adult choosing to share her life with her chosen partner. When I mentioned this concern to my mother, she looked genuinely confused. But that's how wedding invitations are supposed to read, Mija. It shows respect for tradition, for the fact that families are joining together, not just two individuals. Marcus and I are paying for most of the wedding ourselves, I pointed out. Shouldn't that be reflected in how we announce it? My mother's expression shifted to that familiar disappointed look. Isabella, this isn't about money. It's about understanding your place in the family, about honoring the people who raised you and made this day possible. The seating chart became another exercise in my diminishing importance. Originally, Marcus and I had planned to seat ourselves at a sweetheart table, just the two of us, allowing us quiet moments together during the reception while still being accessible to all our guests. But my family argued that this was too American and antisocial. Mexican weddings are about family, my Aunt Carmen explained during one of our endless planning meetings. The bride and groom sit with their immediate families at the head table. That's how people know you value your relationships with the people who matter most. The head table they designed seated 12 people, both sets of parents, my siblings and their spouses, and my grandparents. Marcus and I were positioned in the middle, but somehow we felt like props in a family portrait rather than the central figures of our own celebration. What hurt most was discovering that the speeches had been organized without any input from me. My father had assigned himself the role of master of ceremonies, planning to give the opening toast that would set the tone for the evening. My brother Carlos would speak about watching Isabella grow into the woman she became. My uncle Ramon would offer traditional Mexican wedding blessings. Marcus's father would give a brief welcome to the family, and Marcus's best friend David would share light-hearted memories that wouldn't take too much time away from the real family speeches. No one had asked me if there was anyone I wanted to hear from. No one had considered that I might want to say something myself, or that there might be people in my life whose voices mattered to me beyond their biological relationship to me. Jennifer, my maid of honor and closest friend for over 10 years, had been allotted 3 minutes, if time permits, after the family speakers were finished. Dr. Martinez, my mentor at the hospital who had guided my career and supported me through some of the most challenging moments of my professional life, hadn't been invited to speak at all. The program reflected these priorities. Under wedding party, my bridesmaids were listed by their relationship to my family: Vivian Chen, sister of the bride; Sofia Rodriguez, cousin of the bride; Maria Santos, family friend. Jennifer was listed simply as Jennifer Kim, maid of honor, with no acknowledgement that she was the person who had supported me through nursing school, celebrated my career milestones, and been my closest confidant for nearly a decade. Marcus's groomsmen were listed with their full names and their relationships to him: David O'Sullivan, best man and college roommate; James Murphy, childhood friend; Robert Chen-Rodriguez, brother-in-law and friend. The disparity was glaring. His relationships were honored while mine were reduced to family obligations. Even the music selections had been curated to reflect my family's preferences rather than songs that were meaningful to Marcus and me. Our first dance song, At Last, by Etta James, which had been playing in the coffee shop the night Marcus first told me he loved me, had been replaced with a traditional Mexican ballad that my grandmother had danced to at her own wedding. "It's more romantic this way," my mother had explained when she announced the change. "More connected to your heritage. Plus, your grandfather will cry when he hears it. You know how much that song meant to your grandmother." The unity ceremony had been redesigned around Catholic traditions and family involvement rather than the simple, intimate exchange Marcus and I had originally envisioned. Instead of lighting a unity candle together, we would participate in a lazo ceremony where our mothers would place a decorative rope around our shoulders, symbolizing the binding of our families. While beautiful in its own right, the lazo ceremony emphasized family unity over our personal commitment to each other. The focus shifted from our choice to build a life together to our family's blessing of that choice. Looking at the final programs 3 days before the wedding, I realized that a stranger reading through the ceremony details would learn more about my family's traditions and preferences than about me as an individual or about the relationship Marcus and I had built together. The wedding had become a performance of what my family thought a Mexican-American wedding should look like, rather than a celebration of who Marcus and I actually were as people and as a couple. I was listed as Isabella Chen-Rodriguez, daughter of Eduardo and Patricia, as if being their daughter was more important than being myself. My accomplishments, my personality, my dreams, my voice, none of these things appeared anywhere in the materials that were supposed to introduce me to the people gathering to celebrate my marriage. Sitting alone in my apartment that night, holding those programs and feeling like I was reading about someone else's wedding, I finally understood what Jennifer had been trying to tell me: this wasn't my wedding anymore. But I had no idea how to reclaim it, or whether it was even possible at this point. The morning of August 15th dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden sunlight that makes photographers weep with joy and brides feel like the universe is blessing their union. I should have been glowing with anticipation, should have woken up with butterflies of excitement rather than the heavy knot of dread that had taken residence in my stomach somewhere around 4 a.m. Instead, I lay in bed at the Fairmont Hotel in downtown Riverside Valley, where Marcus and I had decided to spend our wedding night, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that everything would be fine once the ceremony started. Once I saw Marcus waiting for me at the altar, once I heard our vows, once we were actually married, all the planning stress and family politics would fade into background noise. The getting ready process began at 7 a.m. in the bridal suite my mother had insisted we book. What should have been intimate preparation time with my closest friends became a production involving 12 women, 2 photographers, a videographer, and enough opinions to power a small city. My hair and makeup team, recommended by my cousin Sofia because they were the best in the valley and understand how to make Latina skin look radiant, spent 3 hours transforming me into a version of myself that was undeniably beautiful but somehow unfamiliar. The makeup was flawless but dramatic in a way I never wore, emphasizing features with contouring and highlighting that made me look like a professional model rather than like myself on my best day. My hair, which I'd originally planned to wear in a simple updo that would showcase my grandmother Rosa's pearl earrings, had been styled into an elaborate creation involving 2 different hairpieces, enough bobby pins to trigger airport security, and so much hairspray that I was afraid to turn my head too quickly. You look like a princess, Vivian declared, snapping photos with her phone while the professional photographers captured every angle. So much more elegant than that simple look you originally wanted. I stared at myself in the full-length mirror and felt a strange disconnect. The woman looking back at me was stunning, but she wasn't me. She was the version of me that my family thought would make the best impression, the bride who would look perfect in their social media posts and family photo albums. The dress, that elaborate ball gown with layers of tulle and intricate beadwork that had made my female relatives so proud, felt like a costume. Every time I moved, I was hyper-aware of its weight, its volume, its tendency to catch on everything from doorframes to chair legs. I felt like I was wearing someone else's dreams while my own preferences had been carefully edited out of existence. At 2 p.m., the limousines arrived to transport our wedding party to Moonridge Gardens. I had won the venue battle, but somehow even that victory felt hollow now, since everything else about the day reflected my family's vision rather than mine and Marcus's. The gardens were absolutely breathtaking. Late summer flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds, the ceremony space was decorated exactly as we'd planned, and the setting looked like something from a fairy tale. But as I stepped out of the limousine and heard the excited chatter of early arriving guests, I felt like an actress about to perform in a play she'd never auditioned for. The ceremony itself unfolded like a beautiful, choreographed performance where I was simultaneously the star and the least important participant. I walked down the aisle to traditional mariachi music while 180 guests rose to their feet, many of them wiping away tears at the sight of me in my elaborate gown. Marcus, standing at the altar in the tailored black tuxedo we'd chosen together, looked absolutely radiant when he saw me. His smile was pure joy, pure love, and for a moment, the disconnect I'd been feeling all day dissolved. This was why we were here. This was what mattered. The ceremony included all the traditional elements my family had insisted upon: the lazo ceremony where our mothers placed the decorative rope around our shoulders, readings in both Spanish and English, traditional Catholic vows that emphasize duty and obedience alongside love and partnership. But during the ring exchange, something beautiful happened. Marcus looked directly into my eyes and spoke words we'd written together in private, words that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations and everything to do with the life we'd promised to build together. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the garden's natural acoustics, "I promise to love you exactly as you are, to support your dreams even when they surprise me, and to build a family with you that honors both where we come from and where we're going together." Those weren't the traditional vows in our program, but they were the words I needed to hear. For 30 seconds, it felt like our wedding again. Then came the reception, and with it, the speeches that would change everything. My father approached the microphone with the confidence of a man who had been planning this moment for months. He looked distinguished in his new suit, paid for by Marcus and me, though that detail hadn't made it into any family conversations, and he carried himself with the authority of someone about to deliver wisdom to a gathered community. "Friends, family, honored guests," he began, his voice carrying across the reception tent with practiced ease. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Isabella and Marcus, but the joining of two families, two cultures, two different ways of understanding what it means to build a life together." The speech started beautifully. Dad talked about watching me grow up, about my dedication to helping others through nursing, about the pride he felt seeing me in my wedding dress. He spoke about welcoming Marcus into our family and about the importance of honoring tradition while embracing the future. But then his tone shifted, becoming more pointed, more personal. "Now, I have to be honest," he said with a chuckle that carried an edge I recognized but hoped others would miss. "When Isabella first brought Marcus home, we had our concerns. Here was our successful, independent daughter, never married, very focused on her career, sometimes too independent for her own good, choosing someone from a very different world." I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. The crowd was listening politely, probably assuming this was leading to a heartwarming revelation about acceptance and love. "Isabella has always been strong-willed," Dad continued, now looking directly at me with what I suddenly realized was not pride, but something closer to reproach. "Sometimes she forgets that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, but about how you honor the people who made that success possible." The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't the speech he'd outlined to me weeks earlier. This was something else entirely. But today, Isabella is finally learning what really matters. Today, she's remembering that family comes first, that tradition means something, that some things are more important than individual desires. He paused, surveying the crowd with satisfaction, then turned back toward our head table with a smile that made my blood run cold. And speaking of tradition, he said, his voice taking on a tone that I suddenly recognized as predatory, there's something that needs to be addressed here, in front of everyone who loves Isabella. That's when I saw Vivian lean toward him, whisper something in his ear, and nod toward my left hand where my great-grandmother's sapphire and diamond ring caught the fairy light strung above our reception. That's when I heard her say, just loud enough for the head table to hear but quiet enough to sound like a private comment, "Go take her ring, Dad. She doesn't deserve it." What my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about, was that I had been preparing for this moment for longer than they could have imagined. Not because I expected betrayal at my own wedding reception, but because 3 years of watching them systematically undermine my choices had taught me to protect the things that mattered most to me. When my grandmother Rosa died and left me her engagement ring, she had done more than just bequeath me a piece of jewelry. She had also left me a letter, sealed and marked, for Isabella's eyes only, which my mother had handed over reluctantly after Rosa's funeral. That letter contained instructions that went far beyond sentimental wishes about love and marriage. Mija, Rosa had written in her careful script, "This ring has survived revolution, immigration, poverty, and family members who believed they knew better than the women who wore it. If you are reading this, then I am gone, but the ring is yours by right, not by permission. However, I know our family, and I know they will try to take from you what I have given freely. Protect yourself." The letter went on to detail specific legal steps I should take to ensure the ring remained my property, including documentation of its provenance, professional appraisals, and insurance policies that listed me as the sole owner. Rosa had even included contact information for Miranda Torres, an estate attorney who specialized in protecting inherited assets from family interference. I had followed every one of Rosa's instructions within 6 months of her death, long before Marcus and I got engaged. The ring was appraised at $47,000, insured under a policy that named only me as the beneficiary, and documented with photographs and certificates that established its chain of ownership from Elena to Rosa to me. I had copies of all documentation stored in a safety deposit box that only I could access. More importantly, Rosa had explained the ring's true history, details that my family had conveniently forgotten or never known. Elena hadn't received it as a traditional engagement ring from her husband Antonio. She had bought it herself with money she'd saved working as a seamstress, a symbol of her independence and determination to build a life on her own terms before marriage. Antonio had been so impressed by her strength and self-sufficiency that he'd proposed to her while she was wearing it, saying he wanted to marry a woman who knew her own worth. Rosa had worn it through 43 years of marriage, but she'd also worn it through 10 years of widowhood, through starting her own business, through making the brave decision to immigrate to America at age 67. For Rosa, the ring represented not just love, but the courage to make difficult choices and live with their consequences. The men in our family see this ring and think about tradition, about women knowing their place, Rosa had written. But the women who wore it understood something different. We understood that love without independence is not love at all, but dependency dressed up in pretty words. This context gave me strength as I watched my father rise from his chair at the head table, clearly intending to march over and demand that I remove the ring in front of all our wedding guests. But what he didn't know was that the ring currently on my finger wasn't Rosa's original ring at all. 3 months earlier, after the venue conversation and the increasing pressure from my family, I had commissioned a skilled jeweler in San Francisco to create an exact replica of Rosa's ring. The copy was beautiful, professionally crafted, and virtually indistinguishable from the original unless examined by an expert with specialized equipment. The real ring was locked in my safety deposit box, along with all the documentation proving my ownership. I had made this decision not because I was planning for a confrontation at my wedding, but because my family's behavior during the planning process had made me increasingly uncomfortable with wearing something so valuable and meaningful around people who seemed to believe they had more claim to it than I did. The replica served another purpose. It allowed me to honor Rosa's memory and my own preferences without risking the loss of an irreplaceable family heirloom to people who saw it as a bargaining chip rather than a symbol of 4 generations of strong women. As my father took his first step toward our table, his face set in the grim expression of a man about to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. I remained perfectly calm. Marcus had tensed beside me, clearly sensing that something was wrong but not yet understanding what was about to happen. "Isabella," my father said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "we need to discuss that ring." The reception conversations around us began to quiet as people sensed drama unfolding. I could see my mother's face, flushed with what looked like embarrassment mixed with determination. Vivian watched from her seat with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly believing she was about to witness my humiliation and her validation. But I had advantages they couldn't see. I had legal documentation of my ownership. I had the foresight to protect the original ring from exactly this kind of family manipulation. Most importantly, I had spent 3 years learning to recognize their tactics and preparing myself emotionally for the moment when I would need to choose between their approval and my own dignity. "What about it, Dad?" I asked calmly, making no move to stand or remove anything from my finger. "That ring belongs to this family," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd used to make decisions for me throughout my childhood. "It's not appropriate for someone who doesn't understand its significance to wear it." The insult was carefully crafted, suggesting that I, the granddaughter who had spent Rose's final year by her bedside, somehow understood her legacy less than family members who had barely visited during her illness. "I understand its significance perfectly," I replied, still seated, still calm. "It represents 4 generations of women who chose love on their own terms, despite family pressure to conform to other people's expectations." My father's eyes narrowed. He had expected compliance, or at least embarrassment that would make me easier to manipulate. Instead, I was meeting his public challenge with quiet confidence. "Isabella, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," my mother called out from her seat, her voice carrying that familiar blend of guilt and authority. "Just give us the ring and we can discuss this privately later." That's when I realized the full scope of their plan. They weren't just trying to embarrass me into compliance, they were counting on my desire to avoid a public scene to make me surrender the ring without a fight. Once they had physical possession of it, they could argue later about ownership, legality, and Rose's intentions. But they had miscalculated my willingness to protect what was rightfully mine, and they had no idea about the preparations I had made to defend against exactly this scenario. "No," I said simply, the word carrying across the now quiet reception tent like a stone dropped into still water. The power dynamic shifted in that instant, and for the first time since the planning process began, I was the one in control. The single word, "no," seemed to reverberate through the reception tent like a gunshot, silencing conversations at tables throughout the space. I could feel 180 pairs of eyes turning toward our family drama, guests shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as they tried to understand why the bride's father was demanding she remove her jewelry at her own wedding reception. My father's face flushed red, the color creeping up from his collar as he processed my refusal. He had clearly expected immediate compliance, the same automatic obedience I'd shown throughout months of wedding planning when I'd surrendered decision after decision to keep peace. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously quiet in the way that had terrified me as a child but somehow no longer carried the same power. "I said no," I repeated, louder this time, making sure my voice carried to the family members at nearby tables who were craning their necks to witness this confrontation. "I will not be removing my grandmother's ring." "Isabella," my mother hissed from her seat, her face a mask of mortification as she glanced around at our guests. "Stop making a scene. People are watching." The irony was breathtaking. They had orchestrated this public confrontation, planned this humiliation at my own wedding reception, but somehow I was the one making a scene by refusing to participate in my own degradation. Marcus finally found his voice, standing up beside me with protective energy radiating from every muscle. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, his tone carefully controlled but unmistakably furious. "Family business," my father snapped, not even looking at Marcus. "Stay out of it." "Isabella is my wife," Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength. "Her family business is my family business now." That declaration seemed to infuriate my father even more. "Your wife," he said with bitter emphasis, "is wearing a ring that doesn't belong to her. That ring has been in our family for 4 generations, and it needs to be returned to people who understand its value." "Its value?" I stood up now, the elaborate ball gown rustling around me as I faced my father directly. Do you mean its monetary value, Dad? Because I have it appraised and insured for $47,000. Is that the value you're talking about? The mention of money and insurance seemed to catch him off guard. He had probably expected an emotional argument about family traditions and respect, not a practical discussion of legal ownership and financial worth. This isn't about money, he said, but his certainty was wavering. Isn't it? I pulled my phone from the small purse I'd been carrying and opened the Photos app, scrolling to screenshots I'd saved months earlier. Because Vivian texted our cousin Sophia last month asking about the ring's appraisal value. And Uncle Ramon asked my mother if it was worth enough to help with his restaurant expansion. I held up the phone so nearby family members could see the evidence of their conversations, their casual discussions of my grandmother's ring as a financial asset rather than a meaningful heirloom. Vivian's face went white. That's not, you're taking that out of context. Am I? I scrolled to another screenshot. Here's your text to Sophia. Do you think we could get Isabella to sell Abuela's ring and split the money? She doesn't even appreciate vintage jewelry. Should I read the rest of the conversation? The silence that followed was deafening. Our guests were no longer pretending to ignore the family drama. This had become the main event of the reception, a public revelation of dynamics that most of them had never seen before. My Aunt Carmen stood up from her table, clearly intending to intervene before more family secrets were exposed. Isabella, Mija, you're upset. Let's discuss this privately, away from witnesses? I interrupted. Away from the people who just watched my father demand that I remove jewelry at my own wedding? Away from my husband, who apparently isn't family enough to be included in family business. I turned to address the reception guests directly, my voice carrying clearly through the tense sound system since I was still wearing the wireless microphone from our earlier thank you speech. I want everyone to understand what just happened here, I announced, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I finally stopped trying to protect my family's reputation at the expense of my own dignity. My father just demanded that I remove my great-grandmother Elena's engagement ring, a ring that was left to me specifically in my grandmother Rosa's will, because he and my sister believe I don't deserve to wear it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just family drama anymore, it was a public declaration of the fundamental conflict that had been simmering beneath every wedding planning decision for months. They believe I don't deserve it because I married Marcus instead of someone who fits their vision of what my life should look like. They believe I don't deserve it because I chose to be a nurse instead of pursuing a career that would make them more proud. They believe I don't deserve it because I've consistently prioritized my own judgment over their expectations. My father was staring at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief, clearly stunned that his compliant daughter had transformed into someone willing to air family grievances in front of 180 wedding guests. But here's what they don't know, I continued, pulling a folded document from my purse, the letter Rosa had left me, which I'd brought today as a talisman, never imagining I'd need to read it publicly. My grandmother Rosa anticipated this moment. She knew her family well enough to prepare for it. I unfolded the letter and began reading Rosa's words aloud. Isabella, if you are reading this letter in front of family members who are trying to take what I have given you, then you are exactly where I hoped you would never need to be. But you are also exactly where I was prepared to help you. The tent had gone completely silent except for my voice carrying Rosa's message across the reception. This ring does not belong to the family. It belongs to the woman wearing it, chosen not by birthright or family politics, but by her willingness to honor its true meaning. Elena bought this ring herself, with her own money, as a symbol of her independence. I wore it through marriage, widowhood, immigration, and building my own business. It represents the courage to make your own choices, even when your family disagrees with them. I looked directly at my father as I read the final lines. If anyone tries to take this ring from you, Isabella, remember that they are not honoring family tradition. They are repeating the same mistakes that strong women in our family have been fighting against for generations. The power dynamic in the tent had completely shifted. What my family had intended as my public humiliation had become their public exposure, revealing the manipulation and control they'd been exercising behind closed doors. But I wasn't finished yet. The aftermath of reading Rosa's letter aloud created a strange vacuum of silence in the reception tent, as if 180 people were collectively holding their breath waiting to see what would happen next. My family sat frozen at their tables, clearly unprepared for this level of public exposure of their private manipulations. But I had underestimated their capacity for damage control and their willingness to escalate rather than retreat when their authority was challenged. My father was the first to recover, his face cycling through embarrassment, rage, and finally settling on a calculated expression I recognized from childhood, the look he wore when he was about to reframe a situation to make himself the victim. "Isabella," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of wounded paternal concern that would play well to an audience of wedding guests, "I can see you're very emotional right now. This is clearly not the time or place for this kind of outburst." The word choice was deliberate. By labeling my defense of my ownership as an outburst, he was painting me as unstable, overreacting, unable to handle family discussions maturely. The subtext was clear: everyone should discount what I just said because I was being hysterical. "You're embarrassing yourself, Mija," my mother added, standing up and moving toward me with her arms outstretched as if to comfort a child having a tantrum. "Let's go somewhere quiet and talk about this properly." But their attempts to reframe the narrative only strengthened my resolve. I had spent too many years accepting their version of reality, allowing them to convince me that my perceptions were wrong, my boundaries were selfish, and my resistance to their control was evidence of my immaturity. "I'm not embarrassing myself," I said clearly, stepping back so my mother couldn't reach me. "I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference." That's when Vivian made her critical mistake. Instead of following my parents' lead and trying to minimize the situation, she stood up with her own microphone. She'd been scheduled to give a speech after my father, and decided to double down. "Since we're apparently having this conversation in public," she announced, her voice carrying across the reception with bitter authority, "let's talk about what's really happening here. Isabella has spent the past year planning a wedding that ignores our family's traditions, marries someone who doesn't understand our culture, and now she's using our grandmother's ring as a prop in some kind of feminist statement." The word feminist was spat like an insult, and I could see several of my nursing colleagues at nearby tables exchange glances of recognition. They knew me well enough to understand that my advocacy for myself wasn't political theater, it was basic self-respect. "She's forgotten where she came from," Vivian continued, warming up to her theme. "Forgotten who supported her, who made sacrifices for her education, who welcomed her boyfriend into our family even when he clearly didn't fit. And now she wants to stand here in a dress we helped her choose, at a wedding we helped plan, wearing our grandmother's ring, and lecture us about independence." The irony of her statement was staggering, criticizing me for wearing a dress they had pressured me into, at a wedding that reflected their preferences more than mine, while simultaneously trying to take away the one element of the day that actually belonged to me. But Vivian's speech was having an effect on our guests. I could see some of the older family members nodding along with her words, recognizing familiar themes about ungrateful children and disrespectful daughters. Some of Marcus's relatives looked uncomfortable, unclear about what was true and what was family drama blown out of proportion. That's when Marcus stepped up to his own microphone. "I'd like to say something," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. "Since apparently my cultural qualifications are being debated at my own wedding." He looked directly at Vivian, then at my parents, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. "I've spent 3 years trying to earn your acceptance. I learned Spanish to talk with Rosa during her final months. I attended every family gathering, participated in every tradition, asked respectful questions about customs I didn't understand. I paid for half this wedding and contributed to family expenses when you had emergencies." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But nothing I did was ever enough, because the problem wasn't my cultural understanding or my commitment to Isabella. The problem was that you couldn't control my relationship with her the way you controlled everything else in her life." The accuracy of his observation hit like a physical blow. Marcus had identified the core issue that even I had been reluctant to name directly. This wasn't really about tradition or culture or the ring. It was about control. "Isabella is the strongest, most compassionate person I know," Marcus continued. "She works night shifts to save children's lives, she rebuilt your family's finances when her father had his heart attack, and she spent months trying to plan a wedding that would make everyone happy while completely ignoring what would make her happy." He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, not just love, but fierce protective pride. If she wants to wear her grandmother's ring, she'll wear it. If she wants to set boundaries with people who take advantage of her generosity, she should. And if anyone has a problem with the woman I married standing up for herself, then they have a problem with me too. The tent erupted in scattered applause, mostly from my nursing colleagues, Marcus's friends, and some family members who had been quietly uncomfortable with the confrontation they'd just witnessed. But the applause also triggered the family members who felt their authority was being publicly challenged. Uncle Ramon stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get to come into our family and tell us how to handle our own business," he shouted at Marcus. "This girl has been spoiled and selfish her whole life, and now she's got you convinced that we're the problem?" Spoiled? I stepped forward, my voice rising for the first time. "I've been financially supporting this family for 5 years. I paid for Dad's medical bills, Mom's dental work, your restaurant equipment loan, and Vivian's credit card debt. When exactly was I being spoiled?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This wasn't anticipation or shock, this was the recognition of truth that had been carefully hidden from most of our extended family and friends. My Aunt Carmen looked stunned. "You paid for Ramon's equipment loan?" $43,000, I confirmed. Plus the $12,000 for Dad's surgery, $8,000 for Mom's bridge work, and $15,000 to cover Vivian's credit cards last year when she said she was about to lose her apartment. I pulled out my phone again, this time scrolling to my banking app. Should I read the transaction history out loud? Because unlike everything else that's been said here tonight, I have actual documentation. The family members who had been supporting the narrative that I was ungrateful and selfish were now staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to shame to growing anger that their financial dependence on me was being exposed in front of the entire wedding reception. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing for their years of manipulation disguised as family concern, they doubled down in the most spectacular way possible. "That's it," my father announced, his voice shaking with rage. "Security. We need to remove this woman from the premises. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown and disrupting a family event." He was calling security. On me. At my own wedding. That's when I realized just how far they were willing to go to maintain control, and just how completely they had convinced themselves that I was the problem rather than their behavior. It was also the moment I realized I was completely done trying to manage their emotions, protect their reputation, or preserve relationships with people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The real confrontation was just beginning. The security guards who responded to my father's call were professionals from Moonridge Gardens staff, and they approached our table with the practiced calm of people who had handled family disputes at wedding receptions before. But when they arrived and assessed the situation, a bride in a ball gown standing calmly beside her husband while her father demanded her removal from her own wedding, their confusion was visible. "Sir," the lead security guard said diplomatically to my father, "can you explain what the problem is here?" "This woman is disrupting a family celebration," my father declared, gesturing toward me as if I were a stranger who had crashed the party. "She's making wild accusations and refusing to follow reasonable family requests. We need her removed so the rest of us can continue the reception in peace." The security guard looked from my father to me, clearly trying to understand how a bride could be trespassing at her own wedding. "Ma'am," he said to me, "is this your wedding reception?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "My name is Isabella Chen-Rodriguez O'Sullivan. My husband and I are the hosts of this event. We contracted with Moonridge Gardens for this celebration, and we're responsible for all the expenses associated with tonight." I pulled out my phone and showed him our contract confirmation email, along with the final payment receipt that had been processed just 3 days earlier. The security guard studied the documentation, then looked back at my father with barely concealed bewilderment. "Sir, I can't remove the bride from her own wedding reception. If there's a family dispute, you'll need to resolve it among yourselves or leave the premises voluntarily." That moment, watching my father realize that his attempt to have me forcibly removed from my own celebration had not only failed but had publicly demonstrated the absurdity of his position, marked the precise point where his authority over me died completely. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, my family chose to escalate in the most spectacular way possible. "Fine," Vivian announced, standing up and grabbing her purse. If she wants to disrespect our family in public, then we don't need to stay here and be insulted. She began walking toward the exit, clearly expecting the rest of our family to follow her in a dramatic show of solidarity that would leave Marcus and me celebrating alone, publicly rejected by my relatives at our own wedding. And for a moment, it looked like her strategy might work. My mother stood up, tears streaming down her face as she gathered her shawl. Uncle Ramon pushed back from his table with an expression of wounded dignity. Several of my cousins began reaching for their purses and jackets. But then something unexpected happened. My cousin Elena, the quiet one, the one who rarely spoke up at family gatherings, remained seated. "No," she said softly, but clearly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I'm not leaving." Vivian stopped mid-stride and turned back toward Elena with surprise. "What?" "I said I'm not leaving," Elena repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Isabella didn't disrespect our family. She defended herself against people who were trying to humiliate her at her own wedding. If anyone should be leaving, it's the people who thought it was appropriate to demand that a bride remove her jewelry in front of 180 guests. The defection of even one family member broke the solidarity that Vivian had been counting on." Other relatives began exchanging uncertain glances, clearly reconsidering whether walking out in protest was the right choice. My Aunt Lucia, who had been gathering her things to leave, slowly sat back down. "Elena's right," she said quietly. "This whole thing has gotten out of hand. Isabella paid for my son's medical bills last year," my cousin Sophia announced suddenly, her voice carrying across multiple tables. "When Miguel needed that surgery and our insurance wouldn't cover it, Isabella wrote a check for $18,000 without being asked. She never mentioned it to anyone, never made us feel like we owed her anything. She just helped because that's who she is." More family members began speaking up, sharing their own stories of my financial support, my reliability during emergencies, my willingness to help without judgment or strings attached. The narrative that I was selfish and ungrateful began crumbling as person after person testified to my generosity over the years. "She helped me through nursing school," my cousin Maria added. "Tutored me through anatomy and physiology every week for 6 months because she wanted me to succeed. She was the only family member who visited me in the hospital after my car accident," Uncle Carlos said, looking directly at my father. "Came every day for 2 weeks, brought me books and magazines, helped coordinate my care with the nurses." The testimonials continued, and with each one, the family members who had been preparing to walk out in protest looked more and more foolish. They were about to abandon a celebration of someone who had consistently supported them, in favor of supporting people who had just attempted to publicly humiliate her. By the time the spontaneous character witnesses finished speaking, only 3 family members were still standing by the exit: my father, my mother, and Vivian. Everyone else had returned to their seats, many of them now looking embarrassed about their initial willingness to participate in what they were beginning to recognize as bullying behavior. My father, realizing that his dramatic exit had failed to achieve the desired effect, made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he announced to the few family members still listening to him. "Isabella has turned you all against your own family with her money. She's bought your loyalty instead of earning your respect." The accusation was so fundamentally wrong, so revealing of how he actually viewed relationships and love, that it backfired completely. "Nobody bought my loyalty, Uncle Eduardo," Elena said firmly. "Isabella earned it by being kind, generous, and supportive for years without keeping score. Unlike some people in this family." That comment struck home. My father's face went through several expressions before settling on something I had never seen before: defeat. Not angry defeat, not wounded defeat, but the recognition that he had miscalculated badly and lost not just this confrontation, but the respect of people he had expected to follow him. "Come on, Patricia," he said to my mother, his voice now tired rather than angry. "We don't belong here anymore." As they walked toward the exit, Vivian trailing behind them with considerably less dramatic flair than she'd intended, I felt something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not regret for standing up for myself, but genuine sorrow that our relationship had deteriorated to this point, that they had chosen control over connection, authority over love. Marcus took my hand as we watched them leave, and I realized that the wedding reception was far from over. In fact, with the source of conflict removed, it was about to become the celebration Marcus and I had originally envisioned, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about our happiness rather than their own agenda. The DJ, who had been standing awkwardly by his equipment during the entire confrontation, approached us tentatively. "Should I resume the music?" he asked. I looked around the reception tent at the 170-some guests who had remained, at the family members who had chosen to stay and support us, at Marcus's relatives who had witnessed this entire drama with bewildered but growing respect for how I'd handled it. "Yes," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Let's have a wedding reception." The music started again, conversations gradually resumed, and people began returning to their tables. But something fundamental had changed. The dynamics that had controlled my family relationships for years were permanently broken, and in their place was something I had never experienced before: the freedom to be myself without apology, explanation, or negotiation. As Marcus and I took the dance floor for our first dance as a married couple, finally dancing to "At Last" by Etta James, the song we had originally chosen, I realized that losing my family's approval had been the price of gaining my own self-respect. And for the first time in years, that felt like an excellent trade. The reception continued until nearly midnight, filled with laughter, dancing, and conversations with people who celebrated our marriage because they genuinely wanted us to be happy. When Marcus and I finally returned to our hotel room, exhausted but oddly exhilarated, I took off the elaborate ball gown and the replica ring, and put on the simple cotton nightgown I had packed for our wedding night. In the bathroom mirror, without the dramatic makeup and formal styling, I looked like myself again. The woman who had stood up to manipulation and chosen dignity over family approval. The woman who was finally free to build her own life according to her own values. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked as we settled into bed together. I thought about the question seriously. I had lost relationships with people I had loved my entire life. I had exposed family secrets in public. I had chosen conflict over peace, confrontation over compliance. "No," I said finally. "No regrets at all. If you've ever felt like the family ATM, if you've ever had your boundaries tested at your own celebration, if you've ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your dignity, drop a ring in the comments. Sometimes the best wedding gift you can give yourself is the courage to say no." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.